In February 1990, a swarm of police officers descended upon mob boss John Gotti. But he wasn't worried. He told them, "I give you 3-to-1 odds, I beat this case." The following day, he was freed on a $100,000 bail, which was one of many times he outsmarted the legal system. Gotti was a suave and sophisticated mobster that the FBI couldn't catch, and he's worshipped by rappers everywhere. But why? John Gotti was born in the Bronx in 1940 and was one of "13 kids in an Italian-American Catholic family." At a young age, he knew that organized crime would be the only way that he could escape a life of poverty. He turned to petty crime as a teenager, and between the ages of 18 and 26, he was arrested 9 times. He got involved with the Gambino family, one of New York's biggest crime gangs. Led by Carlo Gambino, Gotti was a promising young member among their ranks. By the time he was 28, he was hit with another arrest. He was charged with hijacking a truck and pleaded guilty to all charges. He spent the rest of his 20s behind bars and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. But once he got out, he did not go on the straight and narrow. In fact, things got much worse. Irish mobster James McBratney abducted and murdered Carlo Gambino's nephew, and Gotti was called in to help get revenge. Gotti and others gave McBratney a taste of his own medicine when he too was also abducted and killed. However, Gotti did not get away scot-free for this job. He was caught by police but managed to get away with only a manslaughter charge and went to prison for 4 years. During this time, he was allowed to leave the prison and meet up with other prisoners at restaurants and even temporarily get back to his home in Howard Beach in Queens. The Gambino family used their dirty tricks to reward him with the most hospitable prison sentence imaginable. During his sentence, Carlo Gambino died from natural causes, and his brother-in-law, Paolo Castellano, followed as his successor. Gotti's mentor, Agnello Della Croce, was also given a promotion and controlled half of the syndicate, meaning that upon release, Gotti was also destined for great things. A few years later, it became clear just how brutal Gotti could be. In 1980, his son tragically died in a motorcycle crash. He was hit by a car driven by John Favara, and it was deemed an accident. However, Favara mysteriously disappeared afterward. Witnesses claim to have seen Gotti's wife attacking Favara with a baseball bat before he was kidnapped in the back of a van. He was not seen or heard of since. By 1985, Gotti's brother Gene, who was also working for the Gambino family, was charged with drug trafficking. However, Paul Castellano had forbid the mafia from dealing drugs. He was so against his members messing with narcotics that it was punishable by death. For John Gotti, he had to decide where his loyalty lied, Castellano or his brother. In December of that year, Castellano stepped out of his limo to make his way to Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan. Before he could make his way inside, 4 assassins jumped out and shot him dead in the middle of the street. Sitting in a car nearby was John Gotti, who had orchestrated the entire attack. Gotti was now assumed leader of the mob, and Gravano was rewarded with a senior position. From here on, Gotti became a celebrity and was known for a stylish image and for brandishing his wealth. Rather than keep a low profile to disguise his criminal enterprise like they were known for, Gotti became a celebrity, and he was incredibly successful. It's estimated that Gotti was raking in anywhere from 10 to 12 million annually, which today could be worth around 50 million at least. He was faced with numerous prosecutions but seemed invincible and outsmarted the justice system time after time again. In 1986, he was arrested by police for racketeering charges. But when the trial was done, Gotti walked home an innocent man. The FBI later found out the jury had fixed a verdict. The juror who accepted the bribe spent 3 years in prison for obstruction of justice, but Gotti got away scot-free. He went to trial 3 times, and on each occasion, he walked away a free man. He soon earned himself the nickname, the Teflon Don. Teflon is used in non-stick cookware, and any charges against Gotti would never stick either. He was also known as Dapper Don because when he was on trial, he would bring an extra suit with him to wear after lunch. He was also mixing in with famous celebrities, but whether celebrities really enjoyed his company or not is up for debate. He reportedly once invited Frank Sinatra out for a meal, who said he couldn't make it because he was ill. Sinatra was later threatened by one of Gotti's goons who said, "The next time John sends for you and you make up an excuse, I'll be the last face you'll see on this earth." Gotti also had a weakness for gambling and once spent $300,000 in one weekend. Apparently, his brother Gene and another friend were so concerned about his gambling addiction that they wanted to stage an intervention but were too terrified to carry it out. His position as a criminal who could not be touched started to humiliate the authorities. The public even warned to the fact that he was sticking it to the man. He once told an FBI officer to his face that FBI stands for Forever Bothering Italians. However, by 1990, an FBI agent named Robert Mueller was hired to investigate Gotti. And if that name rings a bell, it's probably because he was also in charge of assessing whether Trump colluded with Russia or not during the 2016 presidential election. Mueller's tactic was to use John Gotti's lavish lifestyle against him. Gotti only dined out at the finest bars and restaurants, so this narrowed down the places you would expect to see him. They wiretapped his usual stomping grounds, in particular Gotti's headquarters at the Ravenite Social Club in Manhattan. Another critical part of tackling Gotti was to take down the chain of command. Gotti was untouchable because he had others doing the dirty work, so they began arresting his associates too. Gotti was the Teflon Don and could hire the best attorneys that New York could offer, but his associates were seemingly not made of Teflon, and there were some crimes that stuck. And this is where they really went after Gotti. He told Gotti's associates that they could reduce their sentence dramatically if they would give any information on him. However, most members of the mafia follow omerta, which is a strict code of silence, but Mueller had a trick up his sleeve. Gotti was too careful to say anything incriminating while out in public, but the FBI did have tapes of Gotti criticizing his associate Sammy Gravano and calling him greedy. Sammy was doing jail time and taking one for the team by not snitching. But this footage of Gotti trashing him made him think otherwise about being loyal to his boss, who would backtalk him. In an event that shocked the FBI and the mob, Sammy came forward to testify against John Gotti. The FBI finally had something on the Teflon Don that stuck. In 1992, Gotti's legendary status as untouchable was finished. He was sentenced to life in prison and convicted of murder, racketeering, and obstruction of justice. 6 years later, he was diagnosed with throat cancer, and he passed away 4 years later in 2002. But his legacy lives in local lore, particularly in hip-hop. During the 80s and 90s, Gotti was all over the newspapers. At the same time, hip-hop was beginning to take off, and his position as a successful, suave, and deadly businessman fits perfectly into the image that gangster rappers wanted to portray for themselves. The first notable mention of the mafia in hip-hop was in the song Road to Riches by Kool G Rap in 1989, and this song included the lyrics "Be like John Gotti and drive a Maserati." It was the beginning of countless mentions of mafia members in raps. This was primarily the East Coast response to gangster rap, where they can make this subgenre their own by drawing upon references to East Coast crime gangs like the Mafia. John Gotti was the most notable mafia boss in the 80s, when the likes of Nas, Jay-Z, and Wu-Tang were growing up. In Nas' 1999 song, Quiet Niggas, he raps, "Please free John Gotti." In Jay-Z's The Ruler Bag, he raps, "I got great lawyers for cops, so dress warm. Charges don't stick to duties, Teflon." Since then, Rick Ross has named his entire album Teflon Don, one of Ross's greatest albums, and used this also as a nickname for himself. There are too many name drops of John Gotti in hip-hop to mention, including one of Chief Keef's earliest songs, but he's mostly presented in an aspirational tone with great admiration and respect. It's clear that a lot of rappers could see themselves, or at least a side of themselves, in John Gotti. In the earlier part of the 20th century, Italian Americans were often considered social outcasts and suffered discrimination. They were excluded from achieving the American dream through traditional means, so had to resort to crime instead. A very similar environment was experienced by Black Americans during the latter half of the 20th century. There's also the Robin Hood effect. A lot of Gotti's business would go back into poor neighborhoods in New York. Gotti's sister, Victoria Gotti, wrote in her book that many of them did take from the rich and often gave to the poor, while lining their own pockets, of course. Gotti was also sticking it to the system. For a lot of young rappers, the police were the enemy, and Gotti was humiliating them at every turn. Hollywood is also a factor, where movies like The Godfather, Scarface, and Goodfellas have glamorized the lives of gangsters and particularly the mafia. And lastly, but certainly not least, rappers love having money. And John Gotti had a lot of money and had no problem showing it to everyone. Maybe it's just as simple as that, and that's all there is to it.